These are the main flaws in this argument. Most importantly, I would say the increasing demand. Now, if this is a city which has been concentrated with technology firms and educational institutions, there lies a likelihood that it is saturated and it's not going to have any further influx of students and young professionals. So, this increasing demand needs to be justified by the author. The author has, of course, failed to justify. Then, there's no clear explanation for preference for small apartments. It very often happens that students and young professionals take up a larger apartment and many of them stay together. They stay in groups so that per head cost is less. As is the fact, affording a studio apartment alone and living with three friends in a three-bedroom apartment, very often the second is a cheaper alternative. So the author has failed to give any quantitative or data-driven analysis for suggesting that there is really a preference for small apartments. Then, no evidence to suggest that the residents would be interested in luxurious studio apartments. This term luxurious is very, very important in the scope of this argument because you're talking about young professionals, you're talking about students, they're preferring small apartments in all likelihood because they have certain budget constraints, and then you're talking about luxurious studio apartments. A major flaw, once again, the author has not provided any evidence regarding the students and young professionals willing to pay that extra bit for affording luxurious studio apartments. No logical explanation for why the valuation of the property must increase meteorically, because what if there is saturation already everywhere? There is no evidence for increase in demand and the assumption that the real estate is going to be all sound and healthy. What are the dynamics of the collaboration between Buildtech and Premia? Now, see, these two companies are collaborating for their first project. Isn't it a risk? Of course, the author has not addressed the risk bit. Any wise investor would think about this collaboration between two businesses in the same industry but different segments. This is a risk. So, these are the main flaws in this argument. If you were able to find around 4 flaws, you've done a good job. A good structure to your essay would be when you give a fine introduction that talks about your stand on the argument. Your stand, remember, on the GMAT AWA must always be that you are not convinced by the argument. Convey that very, very clearly that the argument in its current state is full of flaws and it is not convincing. Then suppose you have found out 4 flaws in this argument, have a different para for each flaw, and then have a very clear conclusion suggesting that because of these reasons the argument is not convincing. This would be a fine structure to your essay. Structure, remember, is very, very important because it helps the algorithm testing your response as well as the human analyzing your response. So this structure does half the job, this analysis does the other half. And read these buzzwords used a lot deeper: assumption, extrapolation, lack of causal relationship, lack of evidence, lack of quantitative analysis, lack of relevant example, generalization. These are all very, very common flaws that appear on the analytical writing section of the GMAT. That would be all. Thanks for watching.